This is the story of how the worst decision of my life, slowly, stubbornly, impossibly, began to turn into the only decision that ever made sense. If this is your first time here, welcome. Subscribe so you never miss a story like this one. And tell me in the comments, have you ever run away from something and accidentally run straight into something better? I want to read every single answer. The night before I left, I was standing in my bathroom in my Manhattan penthouse, still in full stage makeup, watching my career burn down in real time on a cracked phone screen. The bathroom smelled like expensive candles, bergamot and cedar, the kind that cost more than most people's groceries. And the light was that brutal, unflattering white that makes everyone look like a suspect. I looked like a suspect. The headline on page 6 read, "Jade Ellis, Breakdown or Meltdown?" Neither, I wanted to scream into the mirror. Neither. It was a setup, and everyone who mattered either knew it or chose not to. The comment sections were a graveyard of people who had loved me last Tuesday and were done with me by Thursday. My phone had 214 unread messages, and I had read exactly 0 of them. The bergamot smelled like something dying. I was 34 years old, had 3 Grammy nominations, 2 world tours, and 1 very powerful ex-manager who had decided that ruining me was more profitable than representing me. His name was Derek Colton, and I would not give him another syllable in this story. What I will say is that by midnight, my publicist had stopped answering. My label had released a statement that was technically supportive and emotionally empty, and my best friend Simone had shown up at my door with a bottle of Casamigos, and the specific kind of silence that means I don't know what to say, but I'm here. I drank 2 glasses. Then I opened my laptop and typed, "Remote hotels, New Hampshire, no press, no people." Sycamore Hill Ranch came up 3rd in the results. The website looked like it was built in 2004 and hadn't been touched since. There were 4 photos: a porch with rocking chairs, a dining room with checkered tablecloths, a horse named Gerald, and a lake that looked cold and honest and completely indifferent to celebrity gossip. I booked 3 nights under the name J. Ellis before I could think twice about it. Simone watched me do it from the couch, Casamigos in hand, and said, "That website has a MIDI soundtrack, Jade. Are you sure?" I was not sure. I was not sure of anything except that I needed to be somewhere that didn't know my name. I did not expect room 7 to already be occupied. I did not expect the woman inside it to look at me, really look at me, and feel absolutely nothing resembling recognition. I did not expect the small, serious, dinosaur-obsessed 6-year-old beside her to immediately declare me his new best friend and assign me the top bunk. And I did not expect that by the second night, standing beside that cold and honest lake in the dark, I would feel something I hadn't felt in years. The terrifying, electric, completely inconvenient sensation of wanting someone to know me. The real me. Not the me on the billboard, not the me on page 6. Just me. This is that story, and it starts with a stolen pillow. I arrived at Sycamore Hill Ranch at 4:47 in the afternoon on a Thursday in October, wearing sunglasses that were doing absolutely nothing to disguise me because there was genuinely no one around to recognize me. The parking lot had 6 cars, a rusted weather vane shaped like a rooster, and a golden retriever sleeping in a patch of sun so deeply and completely that I briefly envied him with my entire soul. The air smelled like pine and something sweet and smoky. Firewood, maybe. Or hay. And it was cold in that particular New England way that feels personal, like the weather is specifically disappointed in your life choices. I stood beside my rental car for a moment, a beat-up gray Honda CR-V that my assistant Marcus had booked specifically because it was boring, and I breathed. Just breathed. No cameras, no comments, no Derek Colton. Just the rooster weather vane and the sleeping dog and the cold that didn't care who I was. The lobby, if you could call it that, was a room the size of a generous living room with wood-paneled walls, a stone fireplace that was already going, and a front desk that was essentially a kitchen counter with a bell on it, There were framed photos of horses everywhere. Not prints, actual photographs. The kind someone had taken because they loved the horses specifically, not for decoration. A hand-lettered chalkboard near the door listed the week's activities. Tuesday, guided trail ride. Wednesday, bonfire. Thursday, pie night. Friday, stargazing with Dot. I did not know who Dot was yet. I would learn. There was folk music playing from somewhere, low and unhurried, and a smell of cinnamon that made something in my chest loosen by approximately 2%. It was enough. The woman behind the counter appeared from a back room carrying a mug of tea and the energy of someone who had never once in her life been in a hurry. She was somewhere between 70 and timeless, with white hair pinned up in a way that suggested it had always been pinned up exactly like that, and reading glasses on a beaded chain around her neck. Her name tag said, Doty in capital letters, handwritten in blue marker. She looked at me over the rim of her mug, took in the sunglasses, the baseball cap pulled low, the complete absence of luggage personality, and said, "You must be the Ellis reservation." Not a question. A verdict. I said yes, and slid my ID across the counter, the fake one Marcus had arranged, which felt absurd and necessary in equal measure. And she glanced at it the way you glance at something you already know and don't particularly need confirmed. "Room 7, she said, and handed me a key. An actual key. Metal, on a wooden keychain shaped like a pine tree. I almost laughed. I hadn't held a physical room key since I was 19, and touring in van with 3 other broke musicians who thought instant ramen was a personality. End of the hall, 2nd floor. Breakfast is at 8, dinner at 6:30, and we don't have room service, but we do have pie tonight at 9 in the common room, and I strongly suggest you come." She said it like pie was non-negotiable. I said I would try. She looked at me in a way that communicated that try was not the answer she was looking for. 7 o'clock checkout on your last day, she added, already turning back to her tea. "And we have good Wi-Fi now. Well, better than we used to." I found room 7 at the end of a hallway that smelled like cedar and old wood, and something faintly floral I couldn't name. The floorboards creaked under every step, which should have been annoying, and was instead deeply comforting, like the building was acknowledging my presence without making a big deal of it. I stopped in front of the door, key in hand, and felt for one strange second like I was standing at the edge of something. Not a room, something larger. I shook it off. I was exhausted and dramatic by professional training, and probably reading too much into a pine-shaped keychain. I put the key in the lock, pushed the door open, and stopped. Because the room was not empty. There was a woman sitting cross-legged on the bed closest to the window, laptop open, reading glasses on, a half-eaten granola bar on the nightstand beside her. She had dark hair pulled into a bun that was losing the fight against itself, and she was wearing a flannel shirt and a green and navy plaid that looked like it had been washed approximately 400 times and was better for it. She looked up when the door opened, not startled, just interrupted, and her eyes were brown and direct and entirely, completely, insultingly free of recognition. Behind her, on the top bunk of a bunk bed, I hadn't noticed yet, a small boy was lying on his stomach with a plastic stegosaurus in each hand, making them fight in total silence with the focused intensity of a general commanding troops. The woman looked at me. I looked at her. The boys' stegosauruses continued their silent battle. "I think there might be a mistake," I said. "I think so too," she said. "That's my room." "It's also my room," I said. Apparently. She took her glasses off slowly, the way people do when they need a moment to decide how annoyed they're going to be. Then she closed her laptop, set it aside, and stood up. She was about my height, maybe an inch shorter, and she had the posture of someone who spent a lot of time bending down to a child's level and had made peace with it. She extended her hand. "Nora Calloway," she said. "And before you say anything else, I booked this room 6 weeks ago." "Jade," I said. "Just Jade. No last name. I booked it 2 days ago." She processed this. "So the ranch double-booked us. Seems like it." "Classic Sycamore Hill," she said, but not unkindly. More like someone confirming a suspicion they'd held since arrival. She looked at the bunk bed, then at me, then at the boy on the top bunk. "Oliver," she said, "we have a situation." Oliver looked down at us with the stegosauruses still in his hands. He considered me for a long moment with the unnerving seriousness that only 6-year-olds can produce. Then he pointed at me with a stegosaurus and said, "She can have the bottom bunk, but I get to keep both blankets." Dot did not apologize exactly. What Dot did was appear in the doorway of room 7, approximately 4 minutes after I had knocked on her counterbell, with the specific energy of someone who had a problem, listen to both Nora and me explain the situation in overlapping sentences, look at the room with its 2 beds and its bunk and its perfectly adequate square footage and say, "Well, you're both adults." Then she looked at Oliver, who was still on the top bunk with his stegosauruses, and added, "And a very responsible-looking young man." Oliver sat up straighter. He had been won over by Dot in under 6 seconds. I was starting to understand that this was simply what Dot did. "The next available room opens Saturday," she continued, "which is your last day anyway, so it seems the Lord has already solved your problem." She said this with the serenity of someone who had genuinely outsourced all logistical concerns to a higher power and found the arrangement satisfactory. Then she left. The folk music followed her down the hall like a loyal pet. Nora and I stood in the middle of room 7 and looked at each other. She had her arms crossed, not in a hostile way, more in a "I am thinking, and this is what my body does while I think" way. I had my hands in the pockets of my jacket, which was a very expensive olive green field jacket that Marcus had picked for exactly this trip, because it read "anonymous outdoorsy person and not woman whose face is currently on 3 different gossip sites." It was doing its job. Nora looked at me the way you look at a math problem that is inconvenient but solvable. Not like a fan. Not like a threat. Just a person. In her room. That was also, apparently, my room. "Okay," she said finally. "Ground rules." I almost smiled. I didn't. "The window side is mine," she continued. "I run warm, and I need the cold air at night. The bathroom shelf on the left is mine. Oliver takes the middle. You get the right. Dinner is at 6:30, and I would like to not have to make small talk if we happen to sit near each other. No offense." I said, none taken. "And if Oliver asks you to play dinosaurs," she added, "just know that there are rules, and he will explain them in full, and you should listen, because he takes it seriously." I looked up at the top bunk. Oliver was watching us with the patient attention of someone who had already decided how this was going to go. "What are the rules?" I asked him. He held up the stegosaurus. "This one's a girl," he said. "Her name is Sergeant Pepper. You have to remember that." I remembered that. Dinner that first night was at a long communal table in the dining room with the checkered tablecloths, served family style in heavy ceramic dishes that looked like they'd been there since the ranch opened. There were 8 other guests, 2 retired couples who knew each other from somewhere in Connecticut, a woman named Bev who was celebrating her 60th birthday alone and was clearly having the time of her life, and a pair of younger women who were on what appeared to be either a very romantic trip or a very tense one, based on the way they passed the bread without making eye contact. I kept my cap on. My sunglasses were in my pocket. Wearing them at dinner would have been conspicuous in the wrong direction. And I sat at the far end of the table with my hair down over one side of my face and hoped for the best. The food was pot roast and mashed potatoes and green beans with almonds, and it was the best thing I had eaten in approximately 8 months of tour riders and hotel restaurants and assistants ordering for me. I ate 2 servings and felt briefly, privately ashamed of how much I had missed eating food that tasted like someone had made it for the specific purpose of feeding people, Nora sat 4 seats away with Oliver between her and Bev, who had immediately adopted them both, with the enthusiasm of a woman who had raised children and missed it terribly. Oliver told Bev about Sergeant Pepper in full detail. Bev listened like it was the most important briefing she had ever received. Nora ate with one hand and cut Oliver's pot roast into smaller pieces with the other without looking, without pausing her conversation, without missing a beat. The kind of unconscious competence that only comes from years of practice, from loving someone so much their needs become automatic. I watched this for longer than I should have, and then looked down at my plate and focused very hard on the green beans. After dinner came pie night, which was held in the common room beside the fireplace, and was, as Dot had promised, non-negotiable. There were 4 pies: apple, blueberry, pumpkin, and something Dot called maple walnut mystery, with the confidence of someone who did not feel the need to elaborate. I took a slice of the apple and sat in a chair near the fire that was positioned slightly apart from the main cluster of guests, which was my default setting in any room, close enough to not seem rude, far enough to have an exit. The fire was loud in a good way, and the room smelled like wood smoke and cinnamon, and the particular warmth of a space that has been lived in consistently for decades. My phone had 47 new notifications. I turned it face down on my knee and ate my pie. Oliver appeared at my elbow without warning, the way small children do, operating entirely outside the normal rules of approach and personal space. He was holding a plate with a slice of pumpkin pie and a plastic triceratops. He looked at my plate. "Apple is the boring one," he informed me. I said I liked boring. He considered this with genuine philosophical attention. "Sometimes boring is okay," he conceded, and then climbed into the chair beside mine with the triceratops under his arm and began eating his pie with the focused satisfaction of someone who had made the correct choice and knew it. I looked around for Nora. She was across the room talking to Bev, but she was also watching Oliver with that peripheral attention that parents develop, the kind that looks like it's off, but never actually is. She caught me looking. I looked back at the fire. "Do you have kids?" Oliver asked, mouth still partially full of pumpkin pie. "No," I said. "Do you want some?" I almost choked on the apple. That's a big question. My mom says big questions are the important ones." He licked his fork. "I think you'd be good at it." "You've known me for 2 hours," I said. "I know," he said simply, like this was not a counter-argument, but a confirmation. Then he held up the triceratops. "This one's a boy. His name is Professor Bones. You can hold him if you want." He said it carefully, like it was an honor being extended, which, based on what I was learning about Oliver's taxonomy of trust, it probably was. I took Professor Bones. He was small and green and slightly sticky with what I hoped was pie. I held him in my palm and looked at him and felt something move very quietly in the center of my chest, like a door opening in a room I had forgotten existed. Nora appeared beside us a moment later, coat in hand. "Ollie, bedtime." Oliver looked at me. I looked at Oliver. 5 more minutes, he said to his mother, with the tone of someone who knew the answer was no, but believed in the integrity of the attempt. 2 more minutes, Nora said, which was not a negotiation, but felt like one, and Oliver accepted it with the grace of a practiced diplomat. She looked at me then, briefly, and something in her expression shifted. Not softened exactly, more like it acknowledged something it hadn't meant to. "He likes you," she said, quiet enough that it was just for me. "He doesn't like everyone." I didn't know what to say to that, so I said nothing. She nodded once, like nothing was the right answer, and went back to say goodbye to Bev. I sat with Professor Bones in my hand and the fire going and the apple pie going cold on my plate, and thought, for the first time in a week, about something other than Derek, Colton, and Page 6, and the 37 unanswered voicemails on my phone. I thought about a door that had opened in a room I hadn't known was there. I woke up at 6:14 in the morning to the sound of Oliver whispering. He was not whispering to Nora. Nora was a shape under 3 blankets on the window bed, completely still, breathing with the deep and committed unconsciousness of someone who had not slept properly in a long time, and was finally doing it. Oliver was whispering to Sergeant Pepper and Professor Bones, conducting what appeared to be a very serious pre-dawn strategy meeting on his pillow. I lay in the bottom bunk and stared at the wooden slats above me, and listened to him explain, in a voice just barely below full volume, that the forest outside was probably full of raptors, and that they needed to be ready. I had not thought about raptors at 6:14 in the morning in approximately 34 years of living. It was, genuinely, a refreshing change of subject. I should have been asleep. I had taken 3 days off from the world, specifically to sleep, to decompress, to stop being Jade Ellis for 72 hours and just be a body in a bed in a place with no cameras. Instead, I was lying in a bunk bed listening to a 6-year-old brief 2 plastic dinosaurs on tactical forest awareness and feeling something dangerously close to peaceful. My phone was on the nightstand, face down, and I had not looked at it since pie night. I did not look at it now. I looked at the ceiling, the real ceiling, above the bunk, close enough to touch, and counted the knots in the wood, and breathed the cold morning air coming in from the window Nora had opened exactly 2 inches before bed. Because she ran warm, and she had said so, and apparently she had not been exaggerating. It was 41 degrees outside. I had pulled every available blanket onto my half of the room's territory, and was still mildly cold, and somehow entirely okay with it. At 6:30, Oliver decided that the strategy meeting had concluded, and it was time for breakfast, a decision he communicated by climbing down from the top bunk with all the stealth of a small avalanche. He landed on the floor, looked at me, registered that I was awake with no visible surprise, and said, "Breakfast isn't until 8. I said I was aware. "That's a long time," he said. I agreed it was. He sat down on the floor beside my bunk with his dinosaurs and looked at me with his head tilted. "Do you know what a Spinosaurus eats?" I said fish, mostly. He stared at me. It was the stare of someone recalibrating. "How do you know that?" I told him I had watched a documentary once on a tour bus somewhere between Dallas and Austin when I couldn't sleep. I did not explain what a tour was. He didn't ask. He just nodded slowly and said, "Most people say meat. Fish is the right answer." He said it the way a professor says correct. Not as praise exactly, more as acknowledgement of entry into a particular category of people worth talking to. I had, apparently, passed a test I hadn't known I was taking. By the time Nora emerged from her blankets at 7:15, Oliver and I were sitting on the floor with every dinosaur he had brought, 11, in a Ziploc bag he produced from his backpack, with the efficiency of someone who traveled prepared, arranged in a specific order that he had explained to me in full and that I had listened to with complete attention, because it turned out I was genuinely interested and also because the alternative was looking at my phone, and I was not ready to do that yet. Nora stood at the edge of her bed, hair entirely free of its bun now, and going in 4 distinct directions, and looked at us on the floor with an expression I couldn't fully read. Not annoyance. Something quieter than that. Something that looked for just a second like relief. Like she had braced for something and it hadn't come. "He roped you into the dinosaur thing," she said. It wasn't a question. "I roped myself in," I said. "He just provided the materials." Oliver held up Sergeant Pepper in confirmation. Nora looked at her son for a long moment, then at me, then went to the bathroom and closed the door gently. And I heard the faucet run, and I looked back at the dinosaurs and said nothing, and the nothing felt comfortable in a way I hadn't expected. Breakfast was scrambled eggs, and thick-cut bacon, and sourdough toast with actual butter, and a pot of coffee so good it felt like an event. I sat across from Nora this time. Oliver had engineered it by sitting down first, and then patting the seat across from him, and looking at me with an expectation so clear it was essentially a summons. And we ate mostly in the easy silence of people who have already negotiated the hard part and found themselves on the other side of it. Oliver ate half his eggs, declared the bacon the best bacon in New Hampshire, and then asked me, completely without transition, what my job was. I said I was in music. He asked if I played an instrument. I said I sang, mostly, but also piano. His eyes went wide in a way that made something in my chest do a small, involuntary thing. "Can you play dinosaur songs?" he asked. I told him I could learn. Nora looked up from her coffee at that. Not sharply, just briefly, a glance that lasted maybe 2 seconds, and then looked back down. But I saw it. I filed it somewhere without deciding why. After breakfast, Dot announced that the morning trail walk would leave from the back porch at 9, and that everyone was welcome, and that Gerald, the horse from the website photos, would be accompanying the group, but was not available for riding, only for moral support. This was delivered with complete seriousness. Oliver immediately wanted to know if Gerald had a favorite dinosaur. Dot said she would ask him. I believed her. The trail wound through a birch forest that had gone fully gold and amber with the October, the leaves so saturated they looked painted. The ground soft and damp underneath with the smell of earth and cold water underneath everything. I walked near the back of the group, which was my habit. Always near an exit. Always at the edge. And Oliver walked beside me with Sergeant Pepper in his coat pocket and a very specific mission to find a raptor footprint, which he had explained was technically possible if you knew what to look for. Nora walked ahead of us, talking to Bev, her hands in the pockets of a rust-colored canvas jacket that looked like it had seen every season she'd ever been through. She laughed at something Bev said. A real laugh. Full and unguarded, her head going back slightly. And I watched it happen from 12 feet behind her, and thought, involuntarily and inconveniently, oh, just that. Just oh. The small, specific sound of something beginning that you didn't budget for. The lake appeared at the end of the trail like something from a painting. Steel gray water, ringed with birches and pines, absolutely still in the cold morning air, reflecting the gold of the trees so precisely it looked like the world had been folded in half along the waterline. Everyone stopped talking when they saw it. That particular silence that beauty produces. The kind that doesn't need to be filled. Oliver pressed against my side without thinking about it, the way children do when something makes them feel small in a good way, and I put my hand on his shoulder without thinking about it either. And Nora turned around at exactly that moment and saw us standing there together at the edge of the lake, and she went very still for just a second, and something moved across her face that she didn't quite manage to put away before I saw it. She turned back to the lake. I looked at the water. Oliver found what he was convinced was a raptor footprint in the mud by the shore and called us both over to confirm it, and we crouched on either side of him in the cold and looked at a depression in the mud that was almost certainly made by a large bird, and Nora said, absolutely a raptor, with a completely straight face, and I said, no question. And Oliver looked at both of us with the shining satisfaction of someone whose world has just been confirmed by 2 reliable sources, and the 3 of us crouched there by the steel-gray lake in the October cold, and I felt something I had not felt in so long I had stopped expecting it. Like I was exactly where I was supposed to be. The bonfire was Dot's idea, which meant it was not optional. She announced it at dinner, pot roast again, different seasoning, somehow better, with the same tone she used for everything. Calm, declarative, structurally immune to objection. Bonfire at 8, she said, setting a basket of rolls on the table like a period at the end of a sentence. Behind the barn. I've got s'mores materials and Hank is bringing his guitar. No one asked who Hank was. By now we had all learned that Dot's world contained a complete and functioning cast of characters whose existence did not require our verification. Hank would be there. There would be a guitar. The s'mores were non-negotiable. We showed up. The fire was already going when we got there, built high and generous in a stone ring behind the old barn, sending sparks up into a sky that was— and I say this as someone who had seen a great many skies from a great many rooftops and tour buses and hotel balconies— genuinely extraordinary. No light pollution, no city haze, just the full, unmediated dark of rural New Hampshire in October, and in it more stars than I had seen since I was a child in Knoxville. Before the career, before the tours, before the years of sleeping in artificially lit rooms and waking up in cities that never went fully dark. I stood at the edge of the firelight and looked up and felt something loosen in my chest that I hadn't known was still clenched. Oliver was asleep on Nora's shoulder within 40 minutes, the exact trajectory of a child who had insisted very seriously that he was not tired, and then proved himself wrong in real time. He had managed 2 s'mores and a significant portion of Hank's guitar lesson. Hank turned out to be a retired school teacher from Vermont, who played with the cheerful mediocrity of someone doing it purely for love. Before gravity and warmth and the accumulated exhaustion of a full day of raptor investigation claimed him completely. Nora shifted him carefully on the log bench, getting his weight settled against her side, and kept her arm around him without looking down, listening to Bev finish a story about a trip to Portugal with the attentive patience of someone who genuinely liked people. I watched her do this from across the fire and thought about what it meant to carry someone's full weight and not even register it as a burden. To just absorb it, automatically, completely. I had been thinking about that a lot since the lake. Hank eventually circled around to something slow and finger-picked that I didn't recognize, but that sat well in the cold air, and the conversation around the fire softened into that loose, unhurried register that fires produce. People saying more than they meant to, or exactly what they meant, or sometimes nothing at all, just sitting with the warmth and the dark and the sound of wood burning. The 2 women who had been tense at dinner the first night were leaning into each other now, the younger one's head on the other's shoulder, whatever had been between them apparently resolved or at least set down for the evening. Bev was telling Dot about her daughter in Seattle. The retired couples from Connecticut were playing a quiet card game at the far edge of the firelight. I was sitting close enough to Nora that I could have spoken to her without raising my voice, but I hadn't, and she hadn't, and Oliver was asleep between us in weight, if not in position, and the silence was not uncomfortable. That was the thing I kept noticing. The silence between us had stopped being awkward sometime around the lake that morning and had become something else, something that didn't need filling. I wasn't sure when that had happened, and I was trying very hard not to examine it too directly, the way you try not to look straight at something in your peripheral vision, because you're afraid that if you look directly, it will disappear. "You're good with him," Nora said. She wasn't looking at me. She was looking at the fire, her voice low and even. The way people talk when a child is sleeping nearby. That particular register of quiet, that isn't whispering, but is something more deliberate than regular speech. I turned to look at her profile in the firelight. The gold of it caught her cheekbone, the line of her jaw, the particular way she was holding her mouth like she had said the thing, but wasn't entirely sure she'd meant to. "He makes it easy," I said. She made a small sound that wasn't quite agreement and wasn't quite disagreement. Then, "He doesn't do that with everyone. The dinosaur briefings. The Professor Bones situation." She glanced at me sideways. "He gave you Professor Bones." "Is that significant?" "He's had Professor Bones since he was 3. She paused. "His dad gave it to him." Another pause, shorter. "Before." I didn't push on the before. It had a specific weight to it. The kind that means the story is there if you want it, but she is not going to hand it to you. I respected that. I understood it instinctively. The impulse to hold certain things at the boundary of yourself, not because they're shameful, but because they're yours, and because not everything needs to be given away immediately to people you've known for 36 hours in a ranch in the middle of New Hampshire. "He told me you'd be good at it," I said instead. "Having kids. He told me that at pie night." Nora turned to look at me fully then, for the first time since we'd sat down. The firelight was doing something complicated to her eyes, making them warmer than brown, amber adjacent, the color of the birch leaves at the lake. She looked at me the way she had that morning by the water, directly, without performance, without the slight distance people usually kept with me. The awareness of what I was, or who I was, or what they were supposed to feel in my presence. She just looked. Like I was a person. Like I was only a person. "He said that?" she said. First night, 2 minutes into knowing me. Something shifted in her expression. Softened, maybe, or just opened, like a window being raised by a careful inch. "He's not usually wrong," she said quietly, and then she looked back at the fire, and I looked back at the fire, and Hank played something slower, and the sparks went up, and the stars were everywhere above us, and Oliver slept on with his hand curled around the edge of his mother's jacket. And I did not think about Derek Colton, or page 6, or the 47 notifications, or any of the burning wreckage I had driven away from 2 days ago. I thought about a window raised by a careful inch, and the cold, clean air coming through it. Later, after Oliver had been carried up to bed by Nora with the practiced ease of someone who had done it 1,000 times, after Bev had said goodnight to everyone individually like a benediction, after the fire had burned down to the kind of low, steady glow that seems like it could go on forever, I stayed outside alone for a while, not because I couldn't sleep, because I didn't want to lose the dark yet. I stood at the edge of the stone ring with my hands in my pockets and the ember light catching the ground around me, and I looked up at the stars, and I thought, with a clarity that felt slightly dangerous, I have not thought about my own life in 24 hours. Not the scandal, not the label, not Derek, not the statement my publicist had drafted that I still hadn't approved. Not the interview requests, or the think pieces, or the comment sections, or the slow and methodical demolition of something I had spent 15 years building. I had thought about Spinosauruses, and the lake, and a woman's laugh in a birch forest, and what it meant that a 6-year-old had given me his most important dinosaur. I pulled out my phone. 47 notifications had become 93. I looked at the number for a long moment. Then I turned the screen face down against my palm, and I stood there in the dark with the dying fire and the extraordinary sky, and I let the night be what it was. Quiet, cold, completely indifferent to who I was, and entirely, improbably, enough. I found out about the piano on accident. The common room had an upright piano against the far wall, half hidden behind a bookshelf full of paperback mysteries and a large ceramic lamp shaped like a lighthouse. I had walked past it twice without registering it properly, the way you stop seeing furniture in a space once the space starts feeling familiar. And I only noticed it on the second morning, because Oliver noticed it first. He stopped in front of it the way he stopped in front of everything that interested him, completely, suddenly, with his whole body, like someone had pressed pause. "That's a piano," he said, with the gravity of an announcement. I confirmed that it was. He turned to look at me. "You said you play piano." I said I did. He looked back at the piano. The implication was clear and required no elaboration. It was 7:40 in the morning. The common room was empty. Breakfast was in 20 minutes. I sat down on the bench. The piano was old and slightly out of tune in the way that pianos get when they've been in a drafty New Hampshire room for 30 years. And nobody has thought to call a tuner, but also nobody has thought to get rid of it, because it's a piano, and you don't just get rid of a piano. The keys were yellowed at the edges, a few of them sticking slightly, and the bench wobbled on one leg. I pressed middle C. It rang out warm and a little crooked and completely honest. I pressed a few more notes, finding the shape of the instrument, the particular character of its wrongness, the way an old piano has opinions about how it wants to be played. You don't fight it. You listen to it first. I started with something simple, a melody I had written on a tour bus 3 years ago that had never become a song. just a progression I kept returning to when my hands needed something to do, the musical equivalent of a worry stone. No lyrics, no structure. Just the thing itself, quiet and circular. The kind of music that doesn't go anywhere because it doesn't need to. Oliver sat beside me on the bench with Sergeant Pepper in his lap and listened with that absolute, unself-conscious attention that children give to things they find genuinely interesting. He didn't fidget. He didn't ask questions. He just sat there and listened, which was, I realized, an extraordinary thing to receive from anyone, and a particularly rare thing to receive from a 6-year-old. I didn't hear Nora come in. I felt her, the slight change in the room's atmosphere, the particular quality of attention that arrives with a new presence, and looked up from the keys to find her standing in the doorway with 2 mugs of coffee, still in her flannel pajama pants and the green and navy plaid shirt. Her hair just barely caught up into a bun that was already losing ground on the left side. She was looking at me with an expression I hadn't seen on her yet. Not the direct, appraising look from the first night. Not the peripheral, careful attention from the fire. This was something less guarded. Something that had arrived on her face before she'd had a chance to arrange it. She had heard more than I'd intended. "Sorry," she said, though her voice suggested she wasn't entirely sure what she was apologizing for. "We can go." "You don't have to," I said. I wasn't sure why I said it. I said it before I could decide whether I meant to. But I did mean it. And that was the part I filed away quickly and didn't look at directly. She came in. She set one of the mugs on the end table near the bookshelf and kept the other and settled into the armchair closest to the piano. Not close, not far. The considered distance of someone who wanted to stay but didn't want to impose. And pulled her knees up and wrapped both hands around her mug and looked at me with the quiet attentiveness she had given the lake. I looked back at the keys. I played. Not the worry stone melody this time. Something with more shape to it, more intention. I don't know how to explain what happens when I play for someone who isn't watching me perform. Someone who isn't an audience, isn't a camera, isn't a label executive or a critic or a fan holding a phone. Someone who is just sitting in an armchair with their coffee and their knees pulled up, not needing anything from me, not expecting anything specific, just present. What happens is that my hands do things I haven't planned. They find music I didn't know I still had. 15 years of performing had taught my hands to give a show. 36 hours at Sycamore Hill had apparently reminded them how to just play. Oliver lasted 11 minutes before the pull of breakfast overcame the pull of the music, and he slid off the bench with Sergeant Pepper under his arm and headed for the dining room with the decisive momentum of someone who has made a considered choice. He paused in the doorway and looked back at me. "That was good," he said seriously. "The dinosaur song needs work, though." I had not played a dinosaur song. I had played the worry stone melody, and then something I couldn't name. But I told him I would practice. He nodded once, satisfied, and left. Nora and I were alone. I let the last chord resolve and kept my hands on the keys for a moment, feeling the vibration fade into the wood. The room was very quiet. Outside, through the window, I could hear the creak of the weather vane and the distant, patient sound of Gerald moving around in his paddock. "You're really good," Nora said. "The piano's out of tune," I said. "I know." A pause. "You're still really good." I turned to look at her. She was watching me over the rim of her mug, and something in the way she was looking, that direct, unperformed attention, made the back of my throat feel like it was being pressed on gently by something I didn't have a name for yet. I thought about telling her. Right then. I thought, I could just say it. "I'm Jade Ellis. You've probably heard my songs at a grocery store or in a waiting room or in someone else's car with the window down. I have 3 Grammy nominations and a scandal that is currently eating my career alive. And I booked this room 2 days ago, under a fake name, because I needed somewhere that didn't know me. And then you were here, and you looked at me like I was just a person, and I have been making every excuse I can find not to tell you the truth, because the truth would change the way you're looking at me right now, and I am not ready for that. I thought all of it. I said none of it. Thank you, I said instead. Just that. She nodded. She looked back at her coffee. I looked back at the piano. The morning light was coming in at a low angle through the window, laying itself across the keys in a long stripe of pale gold, and the common room smelled like coffee and old wood, and the last traces of last night's fire. And outside, Gerald moved in his paddock with the unhurried patience of a creature who had never once in his life been in a hurry. And something between us in that room was different than it had been before the piano. Not bigger, not declared, just present. The way something becomes present before you're ready to name it. Breakfast was eggs again, softer this time, with chives. And Dot had made cinnamon rolls that Oliver described as life-changing, with complete sincerity. Bev agreed. The retired couples from Connecticut agreed. Even the two women who had been tense on the first night agreed, and they were holding hands openly now over the checkered tablecloth, which made something in my chest feel warm in a sideways, unrelated way. The specific comfort of seeing people who had found their way back to each other. I ate my cinnamon roll and drank my coffee and sat across from Nora and listened to her explain to Oliver, patiently and with genuine scientific precision, why raptors were probably not currently living in the New Hampshire birch forest, though she acknowledged that the footprint from yesterday remained officially unclassified. Oliver accepted this with dignity. Under the table, without thinking, I pressed my foot lightly against hers. She didn't pull away. Neither did I. We didn't look at each other. We just sat there, and Bev was telling the Connecticut couples about Portugal, and Oliver was defending the raptor hypothesis with new evidence he had apparently developed overnight, and Dot moved around the table with the coffee pot and the imperturbable calm of a woman who had seen every version of every human situation and found all of them, ultimately, fine. And under the table, in the warm and cinnamon-scented morning, something that had no name yet made itself quietly, irrevocably known. The afternoon Dot suggested kayaking. The sky was the particular shade of gray that isn't threatening. Not storm gray, not heavy gray, but the soft, diffuse gray of a day that has decided to be gentle about everything. The lake looked different in it. Less like a mirror, more like something that had turned inward. Still beautiful. Differently beautiful. The kind of beautiful that doesn't perform. Oliver could not kayak. This was a logistical reality that Nora announced at the dock with the calm pragmatism of a woman who had long since made peace with the fact that motherhood occasionally required you to sacrifice things without making it a whole situation. The ranch had 2 single kayaks and 1 canoe, and Oliver was 6, and the lake was cold, and the calculation was simple. What was not simple was Oliver's response, which was not a tantrum. He was not, I had learned, a tantrum kind of child, but a sustained and articulate case for why he should be allowed in a kayak, citing, in order, his excellent balance, the fact that raptors were probably not aquatic, and a documentary about kayaking he had seen once at his grandmother's house that he felt had adequately prepared him. Nora listened to all of it. She always listened to all of it. Then she said, "Canoe, with me. You can be the navigator." Oliver considered this. Does the navigator get to name the route? The navigator names the route and identifies all significant landmarks. He thought for another moment. "Okay," he said, "but I want a life jacket that's not the baby one." "They're all the same life jacket, Ollie." "The orange one looks more serious." She got him the orange one. I took a single kayak and pushed off from the dock alone, which was what I had expected and what I had told myself I wanted. The solitude, the water, the gray sky above and the cold coming off the surface in faint wisps. I paddled out slowly, finding the rhythm of it, the satisfying resistance of the water against each stroke, the way the kayak tracked straight when you trusted it. Behind me, I could hear Oliver directing Nora on their route with the authority of someone who had been given a job and intended to do it properly. "Landmark 1, he announced. "That rock. It looks like a brontosaurus." Nora said she could see it. "Recording it," he said gravely, and I heard the sound of a small hand presumably miming the act of writing something down. I paddled until the dock was small behind me, and the only sounds were water and wind and the occasional far-off call of something in the trees, and I stopped paddling and just floated. The lake held me. That's the only way I can describe it. That specific quality of being on still water in a kayak, the way the world reduces to just the surface you're on, and the sky above, and the sound of your own breathing. I had been held by a lot of things in the last 15 years. Crowds, applause, the specific electric charge of 50,000 people singing your words back at you in the dark. I had thought that was the feeling, the big one, the proof that your life had amounted to something. And it was. I'm not pretending it wasn't real. Because it was. It was enormous and genuine, and I would never be ungrateful for it. But this was different. This was the lake not knowing who I was, and holding me anyway. I heard a paddle stroke and looked up, and Nora was maybe 30 feet away, the canoe drifting toward me with easy momentum. Oliver in the bow scanning the shoreline for landmarks with the focused dedication of a small explorer. She hadn't called out to me. She hadn't announced herself. She had just arrived, the way she kept arriving, in that quiet and undemonstrative way that I was learning was simply how she moved through the world, without fanfare, without asking if she was welcome. Just present, and letting you decide what to do with that. "He found 4 landmarks," she said when the canoe was close enough. Her voice was low, conversational, like we were continuing something rather than starting it. "The Brontosaurus rock, a tree that he says is shaped like a stegosaurus tail, a patch of reeds he's designated as a raptor blind, and that dock post over there, which he's calling Landmark Delta, for reasons he declined to explain." "Classified," Oliver said without turning around, still scanning the shore. "Classified," Nora confirmed. I looked at her across the few feet of gray water between us. She was in a life jacket, the non-serious kind according to Oliver's taxonomy. Over her rust-colored canvas jacket, her hair doing what it always did in the late morning, which was making a principled stand against whatever she'd done to it earlier. A strand of it had come across her cheek and she left it there. She was looking at me with that look I was collecting without meaning to. The direct one. The one that didn't need anything from me. The one that made me feel, repeatedly and inconveniently, like being known was not necessarily a dangerous thing. "You okay out here?" she asked. "Yeah," I said. And then, because it was true, and because the lake was honest, and because I was 34 years old and tired of saying things that weren't. More than okay, actually. I forgot this existed. She tilted her head slightly. "What?" I gestured vaguely at the water, the sky, the gray, gentle day around us. "Quiet," I said. "The kind that's not waiting for something to happen." She was quiet for a moment herself, looking out at the water. Then she said, "I come here every October. Have for 4 years. Same room, same 3 days, same dot, and her non-negotiable pie." A small pause. "Oliver started coming 2 years ago. First year, I came alone. She said that last part the way you say something you've made peace with, matter of fact, with the particular steadiness of someone who has processed a thing fully enough to put it down without ceremony. It's the one thing I do just for myself. My sister takes him for the weekend, and I come here and I read bad paperback mysteries from Dot's shelf, and I eat too much pie, and I don't answer any emails." She looked back at me. This year I miscounted and brought Oliver, and also apparently the ranch double-booked my room. "Sounds like a disaster," I said. Something moved at the corner of her mouth, Not quite a smile. The thing that comes before a smile. The decision to allow it. "Worst trip I've ever had," she said. "Terrible," I agreed. The almost smile became the real thing, brief and unguarded, and I felt it land somewhere in my sternum like a struck chord. Oliver turned around in the bow then, apparently satisfied with the shoreline survey, and looked between us with the evaluating attention he brought to everything. He had Sergeant Pepper in his life jacket pocket, the small plastic head visible above the zipper. "Are you two having a conversation?" he asked. "Yes," Nora said. "A good one or a boring one?" "That depends on your definition," I said. He considered this. "Was it about dinosaurs?" "Adjacent," I said. He seemed to accept that. He turned back to the water, pulled his small paddle across his knees, and announced, "Landmark 5. That cloud. It looks like a pterodactyl." He pointed up. We both looked. The cloud did, in fact, look remarkably like a pterodactyl. Nora and I looked at it, and then at each other, and something happened in that look. Something light and warm and slightly unsteady. The specific feeling of sharing a joke that isn't really a joke, that is actually just the world being briefly, unexpectedly good. And neither of us said anything because there wasn't anything to say that would have been as true as just looking. We drifted together on the gray lake for another hour, Oliver narrating landmarks and Nora occasionally correcting his paddle stroke with patient precision, and the three of us moving in loose company across the still water, while the afternoon light held its gentle, diffuse position above us and didn't demand anything from anyone. When we came in off the water, Dot was on the back porch with a thermos of hot apple cider and 3 mugs, as if she'd known exactly how many people would be coming in cold from the lake and exactly when. I had stopped being surprised by this. I had started to think it was simply what happened when you paid genuine attention to people over a long period of time. You just knew things. What they needed. When they'd need it. Oliver wrapped both hands around his mug and declared the cider landmark quality, which I gathered from Nora's expression was high praise. I stood on the porch with my own mug and the warmth spreading from my hands inward, and looked out at the lake, which had gone even quieter in the late afternoon, the surface like old pewter, beautiful in its indifference. Nora stood beside me, not close enough to touch, close enough that I was aware of every inch of the distance. "Thank you," she said. I looked at her. "For what?" She thought about it, or didn't. Maybe she already knew, and was just deciding how much of it to hand over. "For making this trip something it wasn't supposed to be," she said finally. Quiet, honest. The way the lake was honest, not warm exactly, but clear. Clear all the way down. I didn't know what to say to that. So I said the true thing. "I think you did that for me first." She looked at me for a moment. The late afternoon light was doing something to her face that I was going to have to stop cataloging or accept that I was cataloging it on purpose. She nodded once, slowly, and looked back at the lake. And I looked back at the lake. And we stood there on Dot's porch with our cider, and the gray light, and the still water, and the particular, weightless silence of 2 people who are standing at the edge of something and have not yet decided whether to step forward or step back. Oliver finished his cider, set down his mug with the decisive click of someone who had completed a task, and said, "I'm going to go see Gerald." "Don't climb the fence," Nora said, without looking away from the lake. "I know," he said, already going. We listened to his footsteps on the porch boards, then the grass, then nothing. The lake held us. It happened at 9:47 in the evening. I know the exact time because I had finally, after 2 days of disciplined avoidance, picked up my phone with the intention of approving the publicist's statement, the one that was technically supportive and emotionally empty, the labels version, the one that said the right things in the right order and meant approximately nothing. And the screen lit up with 91 notifications and a text from Simone that said only, "They're looking for you. Where are you? Call me. And underneath it, visible in the notification preview without even opening anything, a headline from an entertainment news site that read, Jade Ellis spotted. Sources place pop star at rural New Hampshire ranch. I closed it immediately, but not before Nora saw it. She was sitting cross-legged on her bed, with a paperback mystery from Dot's shelf, the lamp on her nightstand making a warm circle of light around her. Oliver asleep in the bunk above with Sergeant Pepper and Professor Bones arranged on the pillow beside him, with the careful intentionality of a child who takes the safety of his things seriously, even in sleep. She wasn't looking at my phone. She was looking at her book. But I saw the moment her eyes moved, that involuntary flicker of peripheral attention that happens when something changes in a room. And I saw her see the screen before I turned it over. And I saw her read enough. The silence that followed was the loudest thing I had heard in years. She didn't say anything immediately. She turned a page of her book. Or she made the motion of turning a page. I don't think she read a single word of it. I sat on the edge of my bed with my phone face down on my knee and looked at the floor and thought about every moment in the last 2 days when I could have said something and had chosen not to. The list was long. It was, in the specific accounting of this particular silence, damning. Jade Ellis, she said finally. Not a question, not an accusation, just the name, held up in the air between us like something she was examining. Yes, I said. She nodded slowly, still looking at her book. Then she closed it, set it on the nightstand beside the lamp, and folded her hands in her lap and looked at me with an expression that was doing several things at once. Processing, measuring, feeling something she hadn't decided how to classify yet. Not anger, not the starstruck recalibration I had seen on people's faces when they found out. That particular shift, where the person in front of you suddenly becomes a concept, and the concept gets between you and the actual human being. None of that. Just Nora, looking at me, trying to figure out what to do with a truth she had been handed 2 days late. How long did you know that I didn't know? She asked. The first night, I said. When you told me I was the person who'd taken your room, you looked at me like... I stopped. Started again. You looked at me like I was just a person who'd taken your room. And you didn't say anything. No. Because... She paused, not leading me, not finishing the sentence for me, giving me the space to do it myself. That was such a Nora thing to do that it made my chest hurt. Because it felt like... I stopped again. Looked at my hands. Looked at her. Because you were the first person in longer than I can tell you who looked at me like that, and I knew that if I said anything it would change. The way you looked at me would change. And I wasn't ready for that. I'm still not ready for that. I said it simply, without decoration, because it was simply true, and the lake had made me honest, and this room had made me honest, and she had made me honest without asking me to be, which is the only way honesty ever works. I know that doesn't make it okay that I didn't tell you. She was quiet for a long moment. Outside, the wind had picked up slightly, moving through the birches, and the old building made its slow, contented sounds. The creak of wood, the distant hum of the furnace, the particular settled breathing of a place that has been standing through many winters, and expects to stand through many more. I'm not angry, she said. You don't have to. I know I don't have to. A small pause. I'm not angry. She looked at the lamp, at the circle of warm light it made. I'm trying to figure out which parts of the last 2 days were real. That landed in my sternum like a fist, gentle, precise, exactly where it needed to land. All of it, I said. My voice came out lower than I intended. Every part of it was real. The piano was real. The lake was real. The fact that your son gave me Professor Bones was real, and it was... I stopped because my throat was doing something I hadn't given it permission to do. I pressed through it. It was one of the most real things that has happened to me in years, Nora. I'm not performing here. I have nowhere to perform to. There are no cameras in this room. She looked at me then. Really looked. The way she had at the fire, at the lake, on the dock. That full and undeflected attention that I had been collecting like something rare and finite. Her eyes were doing the amber thing again, the warm, complicated color that the lamplight made of them, and her hands were still folded in her lap, and she was sitting very still in the way she sat still when she was thinking, when she was making a considered decision rather than a reactive one. "I know your music," she said quietly. "Not well, but I know it." A pause. "Oliver's teacher played one of your songs at the school concert last year, the slow one. I don't know the title." "Still Satellite," I said. "That one." She looked at her hands. I remember thinking whoever wrote that must have been very lonely. The word sat between us with its full weight. I didn't try to move it. "Yes," I said. She unfolded her hands. She looked at me across the small room, the room we had negotiated and divided and shared and gradually, without planning to, made into something that belonged to both of us. And she said, "Come here." I crossed the room. I sat on the edge of her bed, facing her, close enough that our knees were almost touching, and I could see every detail of her face in the lamplight. The tiredness at the corners of her eyes that was starting to look less like exhaustion and more like someone waking up. The small scar at her jaw she'd told Oliver came from a bike accident when she was 9. The particular set of her mouth when she was about to say something true. She lifted her hand and placed it against my cheek. Gently, with the same unhurried precision she used for everything, and I stopped breathing in a way that was not alarming, but was also not nothing. "I'm not looking at you differently," she said, quietly, directly. "I want you to know that." "Nora, I'm not," she said. "You're still the person who argued for 20 minutes about whether a Spinosaurus could take a T-Rex in open water." "It could," I said, and my voice came out rough at the edges. "You're still the person who held Professor Bones at pie night like he'd given you something precious." "He had," I said. "And you're still the person—" She stopped. Her thumb moved, the smallest motion against my cheekbone. "You're still the person I've been trying very hard not to think about every time you're not in the room." The admission landed between us like the first note of something, clear and irreversible. I looked at her. She looked back. And then, the distance that had been careful and considered and mutually maintained for 2 full days, simply closed. Not dramatically. Not with the sudden combustion of things that have been held back too long, but with the quiet, deliberate intention of 2 people who have both made a decision and are making it at the same time. She kissed me softly. And I kissed her back the way you kiss someone when you've been paying attention to them for 2 days. When you've cataloged every look and every silence and every moment of proximity. When you know exactly how they hold still when they're feeling something they haven't named yet. Careful and certain, like a chord you've heard in your head for days and are finally playing out loud. She tasted like the cinnamon from Dot's apple cider, and the cold from the lake, and something that was simply, specifically her, and I brought my hand up to her jaw and felt her exhale against my mouth like something releasing, like the specific exhalation of someone who has been holding a careful amount of tension in their body for a long time and has finally, in this moment, in this lamplight, in this room that was supposed to be only hers, let it go. We stayed like that for a long moment, and then a longer one. When we finally pulled back, not apart, just back, forehead to forehead, close enough that the space between us was warm, Oliver made a sound in the bunk above. Not waking, just shifting, the way children shift in deep sleep, resettling into their dreams. We both went still and listened, and he settled again, his breathing returning to the deep, unhurried rhythm of someone who was somewhere very far from here and very safe. Nora laughed, very quietly. The laugh she had at the birch forest, full and unguarded, but hushed now, intimate, just for the room. I felt it against my forehead, and it moved through me like the first measure of a song I hadn't known I'd been missing. "He has absolutely terrible timing," she whispered. "He has perfect timing," I said. "He waited until after." She pulled back enough to look at me. Her hand was still at my face, warm and certain. She looked at me with the full and undeflected attention she had given me from the beginning, from the very first night when I had walked into her room, and she had looked at me and felt nothing resembling recognition and everything resembling herself. "What happens tomorrow?" she asked. Tomorrow was the last day. Tomorrow was checkout at 7 and a gray Honda CR-V that was boring on purpose, and 91 notifications, and a publicist's statement, and Derek Colton, and the slow work of rebuilding something that someone else had tried to burn down. Tomorrow was the world, waiting at the end of the driveway, with all its noise and its cameras and its headlines and its very strong opinions about who Jade Ellis was and what she deserved. I looked at her in the lamplight, at the amber of her eyes and the scar at her jaw and the hair that was losing its battle with gravity on the left side, and had been losing it since the first morning, and would probably always be losing it, and was, for that reason and several others, one of my favorite things I had ever seen. "Tonight isn't tomorrow," I said. She looked at me for a moment longer. Then she nodded once, the way she nodded when something was true and sufficient and didn't require further discussion. She turned off the lamp, and the dark was warm, and the birches moved outside in the wind, and above us Oliver slept with his dinosaurs arranged carefully on the pillow, and the old building breathed around us with the patience of something that had seen many winters, and Sycamore Hill held us the way the lake had held us, without knowing who we were, without needing to, completely and without condition. I woke up before anyone. This was not unusual. What was unusual was the reason. Not the ambient noise of a city that never fully slept, not the particular 3 a.m. anxiety that had been my most consistent companion for the last 2 years of touring, not the phone buzzing on a nightstand with something that needed an answer immediately. None of that. I woke up because the room was very quiet, and the light coming through the window was the specific pale blue of early morning before the sun has committed to anything, and because Nora was asleep beside me with her hand loosely curled near my shoulder, and her breathing deep and even and completely peaceful, and something in me came awake to witness it. The way you come awake for things you know are temporary. The way you come awake for the last morning of something. I lay still for a long time. I looked at the ceiling. The same ceiling I had looked at the first morning, counting knots in the wood. And I let myself feel the full weight of what these 3 days had been, without immediately trying to manage it, or package it, or figure out what it meant for what came next. Just the feeling itself, plain and unmediated. The way the lake was plain. The way Dot's pie was plain. The way the truth, when you finally say it out loud in a quiet room to someone who is paying attention, is always plainer than the version you'd been carrying. Above us, Oliver was still asleep. I could hear him breathing, that particular rhythm of a child in deep sleep, slow and absolute, completely committed to unconsciousness, in the way that only small people can be. Sergeant Pepper and Professor Bones were on the pillow. I knew this without looking. I knew the exact arrangement because I had watched him set it up with careful hands every night, the same way each time, the specific order that meant something to him that he had never explained, and didn't need to. I thought about Professor Bones in my palm at pie night, the small green weight of him, the thing that had opened in my chest. I thought about a lot of things in that blue early light, and I let myself think them without flinching. At 6:30, I got up carefully, slowly, the way you move when you're trying not to disturb something precious. Nora shifted but didn't wake. I pulled on my jacket over yesterday's clothes and picked up my phone from the nightstand. 91 notifications. Now 112. The world maintaining its steady indifference to my need for it to pause. And I went downstairs to the common room. The piano was there in the early quiet. Half in shadow, the stripe of pale morning light not yet reaching it. I sat down on the wobbling bench. I put my hands on the yellowed keys. And I played. Not the worrystone melody, not the unnamed thing I had played for Nora, but something new. Something that had no title yet, and no structure, and no verse-chorus-bridge architecture. Just a progression that kept finding its way back to the same place from different directions. Like a person returning to a room they hadn't expected to love. I played it quietly in the empty common room with the fireplace cold and the folk music absent, and Gerald moving in his paddock outside with his patient, unhurried dignity, and I played it until it told me something I needed to know. Then I got out my phone and I called my publicist. She answered on the second ring, which meant she had been awake and waiting, which meant the situation had developed overnight in ways I had been avoiding knowing. I let her talk for 2 minutes. The statement, the timeline, the label's position, the interview they wanted me to do. The narrative they wanted to construct around the narrative Derek had constructed. I listened to all of it. Then I said, "I'm not approving that statement." She said my name in the tone of someone summoning patience from a deep reserve. I said, "I want to write my own, not what the label drafted. Mine." A pause on her end, long enough to be significant. Then, "Jade, it'll be short," I said, "and it'll be true, and I'll send it to you by noon." Another pause. Then, with the resigned practicality of someone who had been doing this job for 20 years. Noon. Not a minute later. I hung up. I looked at the piano. I thought about what Nora had said. Whoever wrote that must have been very lonely. And I thought about 3 days in a room that wasn't supposed to be mine, and a woman who had looked at me like a person, and a 6-year-old who had given me his most important dinosaur, and a lake that held you without knowing your name. I opened a notes app on my phone, and I started writing. Not the statement yet. Something else first. Something I had owed myself for a long time. I was still writing when Dot appeared from the kitchen with a mug of tea, and the expression of someone who had known exactly where I would be. She set a second mug on the end table by the armchair. Coffee, black, the way I had taken it every morning without being asked, and looked at me on the piano bench with my phone and my jacket and my yesterday's clothes, and said nothing, because Dot understood that some mornings were not for talking. She went back to the kitchen. The coffee steamed in the cold common room air. I kept writing. Nora found me at 7:15. She was dressed, jeans, the green and navy plaid, hair in the bun that was already losing on the left, and she had Oliver's backpack over one shoulder and her own bag over the other. And she stopped in the doorway of the common room and looked at me with the full, undeflected attention that I had been collecting since the first night, and would, I understood now, be collecting for a long time after this. "You're up early," she said. "Couldn't sleep," I said. "Too quiet." Something moved at the corner of her mouth. "That's a first." Oliver appeared under her arm, still in his pajamas, Sergeant Pepper in one hand and Professor Bones in the other, hair going in 6 directions, eyes carrying the particular serious weight of someone who had just woken up and had not yet decided how he felt about it. He looked at me on the piano bench. He looked at the piano. He looked back at me. "Did you practice the dinosaur song?" he asked. "I did," I said. He came fully into the room and stood beside the bench and held up Professor Bones. "Play it," he said. Not a request, an appointment that had been scheduled. I looked at Nora. She lifted one shoulder, half a shrug, fully a smile. I looked back at the piano. Then I played, something light and circular and a little bit silly, with a low rumbling motif in the left hand that was clearly meant to be something large and prehistoric moving through underbrush, and a bright, quick figure in the right hand that could have been a raptor, could have been a stegosaurus, could have been anything Oliver needed it to be. He stood beside me with Professor Bones and listened with his complete and absolute attention, and when I finished he was quiet for a moment, considering. "That's Sergeant Pepper's part," he said, pointing to the right-hand figure. "And that," pointing to the left, "is the T-Rex that she beats." "Obviously," I said. He nodded, satisfied. "It needs one more part," he said, "for Professor Bones." "I'll work on it," I said. He looked at me carefully. "When?" I looked at Nora. She was leaning against the doorframe with her bags and the early morning light behind her, and the smile that was the real one, the full one, the one I had first seen in the birch forest and had been trying to be the reason for ever since. She was watching me look at her son, and her expression was doing the thing it had done at the lake, the thing that moved across her face that she didn't quite manage to put away before I saw it. "I'll send it to you," I said to Oliver, "when I've figured it out." He processed this. "How?" "Your mom will give me a way to send it." He looked at his mother. She looked at me. Something passed between us that required none of the words we hadn't said yet, and all of the ones we had. "Okay," Oliver said, with the decisive finality of a contract agreed upon. He held out Professor Bones. "Here." I looked at the dinosaur, then at him. "Oliver, he liked you," he said simply. "He should stay with you." My throat did the thing it had done the night before, the thing I hadn't given it permission to do. I took Professor Bones. He was small and green and slightly sticky, and the most important thing anyone had given me in recent memory. I held him carefully. "Thank you," I said. "And I meant it the way you mean things when you are saying more than the words." Oliver nodded once, satisfied, and went to find Dot about breakfast, because Oliver's emotional register and his appetite operated on parallel tracks that never interfered with each other, which was, I thought, a genuinely healthy way to be. Nora and I stood on the porch in the cold October morning with our bags at our feet, and Gerald visible in his paddock across the yard, moving with his characteristic absence of urgency. The weather-vane rooster turned slowly on the barn roof. The sky was doing the thing it had done all weekend, that gentle, diffuse, non-committal gray that asked nothing of anyone. Oliver was inside saying a prolonged goodbye to Dot that had already involved a full debrief on the raptor footprint situation and showed no signs of concluding. "I approve the statement," I said. "My own version." She looked at me. "What does it say?" "That the story Derek sold was fabricated, that I have documentation, that I'm done being managed into silence about it." I paused. That I spent the last 3 days somewhere quiet and came back with a clearer idea of what I'm willing to accept. She was quiet for a moment. "Is that true? The last part?" "Every word," I said. She looked out at the paddock, at Gerald, at the weather vane turning. "I Googled you," she said, "this morning, before I came downstairs." I waited. 3 Grammy nominations, she said. 2 world tours. The scandal started 6 weeks ago. She paused. "Your Wikipedia page says your favorite food is pad thai." "It's not," I said. "It's Dot's pot roast, as of approximately 48 hours ago." She laughed. That laugh. The full one. I stored it carefully in the part of me that was going to need it later. In the noise and the cameras and the long work of rebuilding. Then she turned to look at me, and she was not laughing anymore. But she was not laughing either. She was somewhere in between, in that particular place she occupied when she was feeling something clearly and letting you see it clearly. No performance, no management, just the thing itself. "I live in Burlington," she said. "Vermont. It's 4 hours from the city." "I know where Burlington is," I said. "Oliver has soccer on Saturdays," she continued. He's not good at it yet, but he takes it very seriously. And I have parent-teacher conferences in November, and a sister who will want to know everything about you immediately, and a very small apartment that has too many books in it and not enough windows." She stopped, looked at me. "I'm telling you the actual facts of my life, so you know what you'd be—" She paused, choosing the word carefully. "Entering." I looked at her on the porch in the gray morning light, at the rust-colored jacket, and the losing bun, and the direct brown eyes, and the scar at her jaw from the bike accident when she was 9. At the woman who had looked at me from the first moment like I was only a person, and had never once, not even last night when the truth was on the table between us, looked at me like I was anything other than exactly that. "I have a publicist who is currently panicking," I said. A label that is being cautiously supportive in an emotionally empty way. "A best friend named Simone who will also want to know everything about you immediately, and will probably know more about you than you're comfortable with within 48 hours, because that is simply who she is. I have an apartment in Manhattan that has too much light and not enough books." I paused. "And I have a song I'm writing that needs a third part. For Professor Bones." I looked at her. "I'm telling you the actual facts of my life." She held my gaze for a long moment. The weather vane turned. Gerald moved in his paddock with his ancient, patient dignity. Somewhere inside, Oliver was finishing his goodbye to Dot, which meant we had approximately 4 minutes. She stepped forward. She took my face in her hands, both of them this time, warm and certain, and she kissed me once, clear and deliberate, in the cold morning air on Dot's porch with the rooster turning above us and the gray sky holding everything gently. 4 hours is not that far," she said against my mouth. "No," I said. "It's not." She pulled back. She looked at me, and then she smiled. The full one, the birch forest one, the one I had been cataloging since the first day without knowing that was what I was doing. And it was the most famous I had ever felt in my life. Not Jade Ellis famous, not Grammy nominations famous, not Page 6 famous, known, by someone who had chosen to know me. That kind. Though we left Sycamore Hill at 8:52 in the morning. Oliver waved at Gerald from the window of Nora's car until Gerald was out of sight, then turned around and fell asleep with Sergeant Pepper in his lap before we reached the end of the driveway. Nora followed my gray Honda CR-V to the highway junction where our routes separated, she north toward Burlington, me south toward the city and everything waiting in it. And we stopped at the junction, and she rolled down her window, and I rolled down mine, and the cold air came in from the fields around us, smelling like October and pine and something sweet underneath everything. "Professor Bones's part," Oliver said from the back seat, eyes still closed. "Don't forget." "I won't," I said. He nodded without opening his eyes, satisfied. Nora looked at me across the space between our cars, the gray sky above us, the road going 2 ways. She didn't say anything, and I didn't say anything, and everything that needed to be said had been said on a porch in the cold morning, and in a room with a lamp and a piano and a lake that held you without knowing your name. She raised her hand once. I raised mine. Then we drove. I finished the statement at noon, pulled over in a rest stop outside of Concord, Professor Bones on the dashboard in a patch of weak October sun. It was 4 paragraphs. It was true. It was the most I had said in my own voice in months, and it felt like the piano. Slightly out of tune, entirely honest, better for being played without an audience. I sent it to my publicist. Then I opened a new note on my phone, and I wrote at the top, Professor Bones's part. And underneath it I wrote the first few lines of something. Not a melody yet, just the shape of one, the idea of where it wanted to go. Circular, returning. The kind of music that keeps finding its way back to the same place from different directions, like a person returning to a room they hadn't expected to love. Like 4 hours, which is not that far. Like the specific, ordinary, extraordinary fact of being seen by someone who wasn't looking for you and found you anyway, in a wrong room, in a nowhere ranch, in the best 3 days of the worst month of your life. I looked at Professor Bones and his patch of sun. Small and green and slightly sticky with pie that was 2 days old now and would probably always be slightly sticky. I started to write. If someone had told me, that night in my Manhattan bathroom, with the smell of bergamot in the air and the quiet certainty that everything I had built was collapsing, that 6 months later, I would be standing in an open field in Vermont, with a 6-year-old pulling my hand and a woman looking at me like I was exactly where I was supposed to be, I would have laughed. Or maybe I would have cried. Probably both. Back then, everything felt like it was ending. The noise, the headlines, the carefully worded statements that said everything and nothing at the same time. It all blurred into one long, suffocating moment where I couldn't tell where my life ended and the version of me people had decided to believe began. But the truth is, nothing went back to the way it was. And for the first time in my life, that didn't feel like something I needed to fix. My career didn't disappear. It just shifted. After I released my statement, the one I wrote myself, the one that didn't hide behind legal language or polite distance, the reaction was exactly what you would expect. Loud, divided, relentless. Some people believed me, some didn't. Some moved on within hours, chasing the next scandal like it was oxygen. And for once, I let them. I did the interviews I wanted to do. I said no to the ones that felt like traps. I stood on a stage again eventually, under lights that used to feel like home, and realized they didn't own me the way they used to. There were boundaries now. Space between things. Silence I didn't rush to fill. And more importantly, there was somewhere I went back to that had nothing to do with contracts or expectations. Burlington. The first time I drove there after the ranch, it took me 3 days to actually get out of the car. I sat parked outside her building, engine off, hands still on the wheel, staring straight ahead like if I didn't move, time would hold still long enough for me to decide if this was real or just another version of something that was about to slip through my fingers. I had spent years learning how to brace for loss before it happened, how to expect the moment everything good would tilt and fall. But then the door opened before I even knocked, and there she was. Nora, exactly as she had been in that room, in that light, in that quiet. And she looked at me like nothing had changed, like I hadn't left, like this wasn't something fragile we had to tiptoe around. And just like that, I stepped inside. It wasn't easy. That matters. Her life didn't rearrange itself to fit me, and I didn't want it to. There were routines, responsibilities, a rhythm that had existed long before I walked into that room by accident. There was Oliver, who needed consistency more than he needed anything else, and I wasn't about to be someone who disrupted that just because I didn't know how to stay yet. But Oliver didn't treat me like something temporary. That was the part that stayed with me. He didn't question it, didn't hesitate. He just included me. Like I had always been meant to be there. Like I had simply taken longer than expected to arrive. "You took a while," he said, the second time I visited, handing me a drawing with 3 dinosaurs. 3. And looking at me like that number made perfect sense. I didn't correct him. I never did. Some things don't need to be explained when they're already understood. Professor Bones got a song. Not one that went on an album. Not one that ever reached a stage or a streaming platform or a crowd of thousands. It wasn't written for them. It was written on a slightly out-of-tune piano, in a small living room that smelled like coffee and books and something warm that I never quite named. Oliver sat cross-legged on the floor, completely focused, like the world depended on getting every note right. Nora leaned against the doorway, arms loosely crossed, watching me with that same quiet attention she had given me from the beginning. Not expecting, not judging, just there. That kind of presence does something to you. It changes the way you exist inside your own life. Months later, we went back to Sycamore Hill, the 3 of us. Same place, same road, same porch, same weather vane turning slowly above everything like time hadn't moved at all. Room 7 was waiting, exactly as it had been, except this time there was no mistake, no confusion, no moment of standing in the doorway wondering where I belonged. We walked in together. Even Dot didn't seem surprised. Of course she didn't. Nothing was the same. And somehow, everything was. On the second night, after Oliver fell asleep, now in the middle, because that had become non-negotiable, Nora and I sat on the floor with our backs against the bed, sharing a slice of apple pie in the quiet way people do when silence is no longer something to fill, but something to trust. The fire had already burned low. The room was warm in that soft, steady way that seeps into your bones without asking permission. For a while, neither of us spoke. "Are you still afraid this will end?" she asked eventually, her voice low, not fragile, not careful, just honest. I thought about it, about who I had been before, about how fear used to sit underneath everything, shaping every decision, every reaction, every version of myself I had tried to hold together. "I am," I said finally, "but not like before." She nodded, like that answer made sense, like she understood the difference without needing me to explain it, because she did. That was the thing about Nora. She never needed more than what was real. "And you?" I asked. She smiled. Small at first. The kind that starts quietly and then settles into something steady. "I've learned that some things don't need to be guaranteed to be chosen." And then she kissed me. Not like something uncertain. Not like something that might disappear. Slow, grounded, deliberate. Like someone who had already decided she wasn't running anymore. And that night, lying in that room that had once been a mistake, I finally understood something I hadn't been able to name before. It was never about escaping. Not really. It was about finding. And finding doesn't happen the way you plan it. It doesn't arrive in the spaces you prepare for it. Sometimes it meets you in the exact moment everything else falls apart. In a place that doesn't know your name. In a life that wasn't waiting for you. And still makes room. 6 months ago, I lost an entire version of my life. The version that depended on being seen a certain way, on holding everything together no matter what it cost. And in losing it, I found something that doesn't fit into headlines, doesn't shrink into interviews, doesn't need to be explained or justified or packaged into something people can consume and move on from. Something quieter. Something real. Something that exists in small apartments and early mornings and out-of-tune pianos, and a 6-year-old who believes in dinosaurs with absolute certainty. Something that exists in the way someone looks at you when they're not trying to see anything except you. And for the first time in a long time, I don't feel the need to turn it into anything else. I just live it.